So really excited to be back speaking with the group again today. For folks who maybe weren't on the webinar, the last webinar last week, I'm from Big River Analytics. My name is Rebecca. Big River has been operating for the last 9 years, and we've done hundreds of projects with Indigenous governments, communities, and organizations from across Canada. Originally based in Terrace, BC, which is Tsimshian territory. So many of our first clients are from there and remain clients today. And overall, our mission is to provide statistical and analytical capacity to benefit Indigenous communities. And so this has ranged from, making use of economic tools and data collection and data analysis, what we talked about more concretely in our last webinar, to benefit Indigenous communities by, potentially securing funding for those communities, to helping governments set up and make use of and manage new data systems. So we're an interdisciplinary team. We've got data scientists and management specialists, economists and statisticians, who all help to provide that value back and make use of data to benefit Indigenous communities. My background, I'm Welsh and British on my mother's side, and Ukrainian and a mix of Eastern European on my father's side. I'm really excited to have Leila here joining us today. She recently joined the team, and I'll let her introduce herself before we dive into some of the content.
For sure. Hi, everyone. When Rebecca says recently, she means like really, really recently. Like I think today is a month exactly that I've been with Big River. But I am based in Toronto, Dishwood Spoon territory since 2018. And I'm currently on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Chippewa, Wendat peoples, Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe. I'm originally from Southeast Europe. I'm Serbian and Bosnian, and I'm a very, very freshly baked immigrant here. So my background is also in political science and international relations. And I then moved into data privacy and data security. And I'm sharing all this just so that you know that what I try to do is I try to put a social justice and political lens onto data security and privacy, which is something I don't think we do enough. And that's what we're going to try and share with you today. And just one heads up is that I'll be using government, organization, and team and all of these terms interchangeably, just so that I do justice to all the different structures and hierarchies that may exist. So you'll hear the different terms, but they're all meant to refer to you.
Great, thanks, Leila. So in terms of our agenda today, we're going to start by talking a little bit about the motivation for some of this work. I think that this will carry through a lot of different threads from some of the previous webinars. We have our 3 key takeaways. So if you were on the webinar last week, this won't be a surprise. This is our 3 things we're hoping you can take away from this webinar in pretty concrete and explicit terms. We have some key terms and concepts to understand, and really the objective here is to give you a starting point, to give you some of the language and key principles and topics really focused on privacy and security. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the data management lifecycle and some data quality pieces, and what are the questions that you should be asking yourself to be integrating security and privacy into your data management lifecycle. We also have some strategies and approaches for phase 1. So this is great to have had Bobby and Stuart share some very similar principles and practices in terms of mapping out where your data is, what some of the risks might be, to help you understand what the security and privacy approaches might be that are appropriate. So I think there's lots of alignment between some of the records management and consent pieces that we heard from Bobby and Stuart's presentation and some of the principles and concepts we'll be sharing with the group today. So before we dive into the webinar content we have outlined, there's lots more information that's available on the toolkit that we're not going to present today. And so I'm going to take a few minutes to just walk through some of those components of the toolkit, and also just share a little bit about kind of why we landed on the focus for today. So as I mentioned, the objective is getting some foundational understanding, some foundational concepts and principles, but really this is a complex topic. This is something that takes a lifetime of learning. Even security mature organizations who've been working on this for many, many, many years, this isn't something that's complete and that you put to bed. This is something you continue to maintain and work on. And knowing that, as Bobby and Stuart said, many of the governments are in different places and along different kind of phases of this spectrum, some of this content will be more or less relevant to your government and your community, depending on where you're at. So we've tried to focus on information that's relevant kind of regardless of where you're at in the spectrum. What does that spectrum look like? And I'll show you some of the material that might be more or less relevant that's on the toolkit online that's a little bit more specific. The other thing to kind of keep in mind around these topics is many of them are, like I said, specific to your organization. And oftentimes when you're faced with, a data issue or data management issue or security issue, we just jump straight to solutions. We jump straight to the system as a solution. And what we really want to think about is a system isn't necessarily a solution. The data management lifecycle shows how all these pieces link together and are related to each other. And it's important not only to understand the system you're using or the system you're not using, but also those policies and practices. And some of those might be, depending on where you're at, those might just be implicit policies and practices that haven't actually explicitly been put down on paper. But getting an understanding of what's going on the ground before you jump to a system as a solution is really important. So we do talk about IT procurement in the actual toolkit, but we're going to focus on, like I said, some of those core concepts around privacy and security today. So I'm just going to switch screens. Does everyone see the toolkit? Great. So up here, you can get into all of the different topics covered in the toolkit. Today, we've been talking about data management. We will be talking about the data lifecycle. And then here on the side, you can go to some of the other topics that are covered. So we have IT systems. So for governments that are thinking about procuring a new system or thinking about assessing some of their existing systems, we have some information for you on how to identify what a system requirement might be. So if you are thinking about buying a system, what are some of the questions that you might ask yourselves and your staff before you go about purchasing a specific system? The total cost of ownership. So there's a bunch of different models for software. So how do you actually assess what this is going to cost in terms of your lifetime of using this software? Maintenance being one component. So there's lots of different components that you can use in here to assess the cost of your ownership. And then once you've made some of those decisions, how do you go about making a business case or actually putting out a request for proposals? So lots of good information on IT in there that we won't cover in much detail today. In terms of data quality, we are going to talk about data quality because these things are all interconnected. Your IT system and your system design will influence the data quality your administrative data sets produce. But there is more detail here on things like metadata, so your documentation. I think it's great that Bobby and Stuart shared so much information on things like naming conventions and those actual details to records management, because all of those complement data quality. If you don't have those good record management systems in place, it becomes really difficult to make use of and actually build indicators out of the information that you have. We will talk a little bit about quality assurance, but again, lots more details in the webinar, in the toolkit there. We do talk about storage and data backup and preservation a little bit. And again, this was covered with some of the points in Bobby and Stuart's presentation, but the kind of take home message that we have related to privacy and security here and data quality is just that these things will dictate whether you can or can't access that information, and the way that you go about collecting that information will have implications in terms of whether you archive or store it and how you go about actually picking those solutions. The focus of our presentation is data security and privacy. There's lots of information on principles and concepts here. We try to draw some of those into our presentation. But again, like I said, this is kind of a lifetime of learning here. So there's lots more detail, and we try to highlight some of those key foundations that can inform your thinking when you're going through collecting and using data. So I'm going to switch back to the presentation now. And we're going to start with some motivations. So I think, we've all been part of these webinars for a few weeks now. So there's been lots of motivation around privacy and security and things to think about. I think the piece that I'll speak to, and then I'll pass it over to Layla to speak to those first 3 points here, is around the strength of your privacy and security capacity really being linked to your ability to unlock new data avenues. And so we've seen some examples with Bobby and Stuart. If you have thought through your privacy and consent model, having that completed and identifying the different uses for data allows you to actually make use of that data in the future. So having a strong privacy and security program unlocks the capacity for you to use some of your own internal data sources. Similarly, oftentimes, and I was speaking with Harmony about this before our webinar, privacy and security considerations are the things that other organizations tell you, this is the reason you can't have access to your data. So it also has the potential, if you enhance those programs, then you have the potential to access new and more different types of data about your citizens. And so, that's kind of one motivation for why we're here, but I'll pass it over to Layla to speak to some of those other points.
Yeah, I think that one of the main things that we wanted to share today, and you're lots of information is being thrown at you, and if you remember a few things from today, what we wanted to do today is make cybersecurity, data security, and data privacy more accessible, and help you advance on that journey wherever you are, whether you're at the start, whether you're kind of in the middle and are trying to improve. We wanted to help you get a little bit ahead, but also demystify all of this. One of the biggest points, and something that I know has helped me reframe the way I think about data privacy security, is that we often forget that personal data we're working with, those are actually people, those are actually individuals, and those are their real lives. So if anything goes wrong with that data, you're putting people's real lives in danger. So if you compromise that data, anything can happen. It could be a data leak. It could be a threat actor, a third-party threat actor that comes in and wreaks havoc on your systems. You could press the wrong link. It happens to anyone and everyone, and you download malware and it compromises your whole network. So this is something that you have a responsibility to protect individuals that are entrusting you with their data. You have the responsibility to protect the communities that are entrusting you with their data. But more than just thinking of, oh, I need to be compliant with a certain regulation or a certain law not to get in trouble, whatever that means, this is more a moral responsibility to protect people who are trusting you, to protect the communities. And also an added layer is the fact that we are having traditional knowledge that is now becoming digitized, and we need to ensure that that is also protected. And we'll get into more detail on what that looks like. But remember that the main idea here is enable you to protect the people that are trusting you, and also make this a little bit more accessible, because I know that cybersecurity and data privacy can often seem like a little bit of a black box or intimidating. So organizations and governments will rather maybe not deal with it in detail because it can seem so overwhelming. And we have some actual actionable steps for you that you can follow to get ahead of this journey.
Great, thanks, Layla. So our key 3 takeaways here. Takeaway number 1, privacy and security are part of every aspect of data management. So if there's one of 3 things you can take away today, we would say the first one would be to really think about this not as separate from any of the other webinar topics you've seen or any of the other work and processes that you might be considering. This is a part of the day-to-day activities of your organization or your government. This is part of your government's culture. And think about the training and requirements that are needed to integrate this into everyday thinking. And so we have some questions to ask yourself at different phases of the data management lifecycle to start integrating some of this thinking into day-to-day activities. The second takeaway is to set some realistic expectations for your privacy and security program. So this is something that really takes time. As Layla said, it can be intimidating for an organization or a government of any size to think about these topics. The risks feel real, and we all know that the risks exist, but this isn't something that you can change overnight. So understanding that this is a security maturity spectrum. I like this word because it rhymes. Layla introduced security maturity to me and it was great. Now I use it all the time. But this is something that you do in phases, right? So you might be, in phase 1 where you're trying to get a sense of all of the systems and data that you have, or you may have already done some of that mapping or be really excited to use some of Bobby and Stuart's new tools to do some of that mapping and be thinking more about risk. So what are the risks associated with some of those systems and tools and that you're already using and the data that is implicitly being collected or explicitly you're going out and collecting using those. And really the objective here is to get to the final phase, which isn't the tick box, great, I'm done my security and privacy work. It's about maintaining and improving those systems. So setting up some foundations so that you're getting away from building the new and starting to maintain and improve on what systems and processes you have in place.
Yeah, and if it means anything, if you try and do this overnight, you're not going to do a good job. So there's no way you can just kind of implement everything in a month and think that you have everything ready. It takes time, and a good data privacy, data security program really takes a long time to build out, and you shouldn't rush that process.
Takeaway number 3, so data becomes sensitive when it has enough context. So if you know a phone number, but you don't know whose phone number it is, or if you know a password, but you don't know what system the password actually is for or who the password belongs to, that information is less sensitive than when it's combined with those other things. And so this is part of understanding data allows you, and understanding where that context is allows you to start thinking about ways that you can minimize risk from the data that you do have, collect and store data in a way that minimizes that risk, and also be able to make, like we kind of said in the motivation, to be able to make use of more and different types of data. If you know what context combining these two pieces together will create that sensitivity, then you're going to be able to use more and different data sources, knowing like what you need to do to minimize the risk to actually use this. So we see a lot of governments and organizations that we work with who have a lot of fear of using any of their data or putting any of their data in a certain type of system because they really are cognizant of the potential risks. And the more you understand about data and what makes data sensitive and what that context is and can do with data, the more you'll be able to kind of make informed decisions about where it's useful and where it's applicable and where it's appropriate to use data versus where you really need to be cognizant of some of those privacy and security concerns.
Yeah. And you can also think about whether you really need that data to be in clear text and readable, or if it's something that, you know, it doesn't have to be the actual SIN number, for example, or it can be coded into like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can just use it. So it's supposed to make you think about what format of the data do you actually need for it to be useful.
So we have some key terms and concepts to understand here. I'm going to let Layla take charge here and just tell me when you want to advance slides. And we're going to take a look through what we mean by governance, IT, cybersecurity, privacy, data management, and data. But importantly, what the differences are between these two terms, because oftentimes or at least, we think of these things all combined, and it's hard to understand where the lines are because these things are all interconnected. So yeah. Layla, over to you. I can advance to the next slide.
Yeah, for sure. You can do that already. So the main idea is to decouple these terms, as Rebecca said, because the number of times somebody has told me that they work in IT, and I'm thinking you might as well have told me that you work with paper, because that's how broad IT is. And I'll hear people telling me they work in cybersecurity, they work in privacy, they work in information security, all of these terms, and sometimes they get conflated and confused. And we have this, I think, relatively useful analogy with the library that helps you understand all of these differences. So if we think about data, and I know this goes in line with the previous presentation, so I might get challenged in this after that records discussion, but if you think about data, a type of data, just one piece of data is like a word in a book. So if it's not correlated with other words to form sentences, words and data do not mean much separately. And you can think of data sets as books, because data sets tend to tell a complete story and give individual words power. So you have data that turns into data sets or sentences, and then even larger data sets that are books. Now, data management within this library metaphor would be the process of acquiring the books, of storing them, classifying them, shelving them, moving them around aisles, archiving them, keeping track of them through a system. So anything that you would do to manage those books and move them around and keep track of them. Now, privacy would be understanding which books have sensitive stories, which ones need to be kept safe, who should have access to them, and if it's only a select group of people, making sure that they're locked away or written in a secret language only a few understand. So you start thinking about them in a slightly different way. Now, cybersecurity is all of the measures that you would have in place to keep the book safe. Now, this can include anything from the fire extinguishers to the system you're using to know where the books are, who has access to the books, the building alarm, everything that is kind of meant to keep the books in a good shape and to keep them safe. Now, the next level, and the one where everybody tells me that's what they do, is the IT level. And the IT level means pretty much anything involved with the library. So we're talking about the words in the books. We're talking about the books themselves, the aisles, the shelves, the extinguishers, classifying and archiving software, your access controls, meaning who can enter, who can get a library card, plus all the librarians and all the staff working there. You're also thinking about the architecture of the building itself, the plumbing and electricity, everything helps the library run. What I'm trying to say by this is that IT can be anything, from your website, the front end and back end of your website. It is your network. It is how you're storing the files, where are you storing the files. It includes absolutely everything that is technology. And when somebody says IT, that is what they mean. So IT is absolutely anything that is digital involved with your government. And the final layer and we're looking at is the governance layer. So what do we mean when we say your data security and data privacy governance structure? Think about it as, again, the librarians who are running the library, all the people, so all the people who run the library, and the guidelines and policies that define how they do their jobs. So in this case, they know what they need to do and how they need to do it, but a proper data privacy and data security structure would involve kind of having the chief information security officer, or having, knowing who your privacy designate is, knowing if you need legal counsel for your privacy. And then if you have the capacity to have specific people in charge of specific domains, so you have a network security person who owns that domain, or antiviral, so to speak, malware defense person who is in charge of that domain. So I hope that when you look at this graphic, it helps you decouple some of these terms and makes things a bit clearer. You can go to the next slide, yeah. Then we already discussed this, kind of how you need to think about data sets and how data, when it's put into a larger context, becomes more and more dangerous, and how you need to think about what that context is and what that needs to be. So I think that we can move ahead. Yeah.
So we're going to talk about the data management lifecycle a little bit. Our focus is going to be twofold. First, on data set and data system quality and how those things relate to IT. You can imagine how excited we were to help contribute to the Toolkit IT component, with IT being such a broad definition. So there's hence the reason why there's lots of content on the website that we're not going to be touching on today. But we are going to talk about the data management lifecycle as a core component for you to help you understand how these pieces of the puzzle fit together, and then talk about this data set and data system quality. And then Layla will walk through some questions that allow you to build some capacity and thinking around privacy and security in each of these phases. So this is a screenshot of the graphic that exists on the website. The data management lifecycle is this inner orange ring. So this is about identifying what your data source is. Once you've identified that source, transferring that source over and acquiring that data. So there's lots of privacy and security considerations that might need to be in place depending on where that data source is and what the original consent forms and process for actually collecting that data were. Once you've acquired that data, there's a whole kind of focus around analyzing that data, and that's usually about building those indicators for tracking at this stage and kind of the focus of this webinar series. And some things to think about in that vein are, what are the IT potential systems and tools and software that you're using, and how do those systems and software interact with your data? Communicating and sharing knowledge built from your data. That's the fun part, the exciting part, the part that we're all most looking forward to. But there's also some privacy and security considerations for how you present that data, how you make decisions around what you're doing to actually bring forward the information that you've analyzed to wider audiences. We've already talked a little bit about preservation and archiving and deletion of records, so we won't focus too much on that today. But really the important thing to realize is that these are all interconnected. So the quality of your data oftentimes relies on your information technology systems, which oftentimes relies on the processes that you have in place around this data management lifecycle. Similarly, your storage and backup, this will influence the ability for you to actually acquire data. So if you have an administrative system that stores data in a particular way, that may or may not allow you to make use of that information to build an indicator of interest. And security and privacy really here wraps up in every phase, in every component and piece of this puzzle. So this isn't a discrete piece. The pieces of the puzzle really encompass this entire graphic. So when it comes to data system and data set quality, again, like I said, these things are all interconnected. So there's a few kind of core concepts that we go into more detail in the toolkit here around. But when we think about data system quality, we want to think about there being some some principles that we found really useful to think about this thing is making sure that there's a single source of truth. So what is your authoritative understanding of a data set? And, some of the governments that we've worked with in the past have, and to kind of Hannes's point in our webinar last week, really invested in their membership and citizens list. And they have that single authoritative source of truth of who is a member, who is a citizen of their nation. Other nations who are kind of in different areas of the spectrum have competing lists for this. And it generates a lot of challenges in terms of making use of that data, because you have, multiple different lists that say there's multiple different numbers of people that are members. So single source of truth is a useful concept to think about when you're thinking about data system quality, and data system quality is really spanning across multiple data sets across all of the different IT systems that might be generating data. Again, we talk about this in more detail in the toolkit, but a lot of these things are related. So many of the quality assurance and best practices that you can have relate to what type of system you're using. So the principles that we'll talk about in terms of data set quality could be useful if you're working in an Excel sheet or if you're designing a custom database system. And the quality assurances and best practices depend on kind of what tool you're using and where you're at in that process. When we talk about data set quality, so you'll see lots of linkages between data set quality and some of the system implications here. But when we talk about high quality data, we want to talk about data that's accurate. So is the information actually factual? Is my birth date stored correctly at the record level, or is it the incorrect date? We want to talk about consistency as well. And so there's some clear linkages between your data systems here, because oftentimes those data systems will define how your data is entered. Is information entered consistently? So, for instance, is my income listed as hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars, or just as my income? If that is listed inconsistently and people are entering it differently because they have a different implicit or explicit policy or procedure for how they enter that information, it's going to make it really challenging to actually make use of this information from an indicator perspective. Is the information complete? So is there a record for me? Is there a record for Layla? Is Layla and my first and last name there, or do we just have a record for me and not for her? Uniqueness. So this is again linking to that concept of a single source of truth. So are there multiple records for me and multiple records for Layla? If so, is there a reason for that, or is that an error? And how do you work through those kind of record management components when you do find that there are duplicate records? But similarly and importantly, especially when you're thinking about a project and data collection or data system design from the outset, are there duplicate concepts? So do I store both my date of birth and my age? If so, why? Because we want to try to limit the amount of information we're collecting and create a single source of truth around what the appropriate field or record is for that individual. Excuse me. Timeliness is the data available and updated and processed in a timely manner? And then relevance here, does it actually measure what it's supposed to measure? So thinking about relevance in terms of a data set, if you're trying to build an indicator around someone's employment history and you ask them what job they held 10 years ago, that might give you an indication of what their employment was, but it's probably more accurate to actually go back and look at their employment record or their income record to see what their employment was, because people have difficulty recalling kind of that far into the past. So again, this is just to give folks a sense of how these systems interact and influence data set quality, and how data set quality can inform the indicators that you are able to create and collect and analyze out of all of this IT kind of infrastructure. I'm going to pass it over to Layla, because our second kind of focus for the data management lifecycle is about building privacy and security into every phase of the data lifecycle. So we've put together some questions for consideration for each of those phases, and I will pass it over to her.
Sure. So yes, this is our attempt to kind of ground things a little bit more, because everything we have said so far has been relatively abstract and perhaps doesn't really give you anything to act on and to be able to fully understand how you need to approach data security and privacy. So what we did is that we took that very nice graphic that we have of the data management lifecycle, and took those phases and kind of tried to put all the questions in there that you need to be asking yourself in each phase. So for example, in phase 1 and 2, when you're just identifying your data sources and starting to acquire the data, you need to think about, am I collecting data in a secure way? What that means is, how am I receiving it? Is it being mailed to me in paper form, where all of that data, if it's interrupted, it can be read? How am I collecting it? Are people emailing it to me? Are they emailing it to one central email account? Who has access to that email account? Am I collecting consent from individuals? And we saw how important consent is in the previous presentation. But in this case, when you're gathering information from individuals, you want to make sure that you're collecting it, number one, but that you're also recording it properly, because if somebody comes and asks you about it, you will have access to it. Have you informed all of the individuals properly about what you're going to do with their data and what data sets you're going to be collecting from them? Do I really need to share, collect, store all this data, or only a few of these data sets necessary? So that's data minimization that we've touched upon a couple of times. And can I anonymize this data as soon as I get it, or do I need it fully readable? So these are just a few things that you can think about. Rebecca, if you go to the next slide, I think this continues. Oh, no, we are already phase 3 and 4, so you can go back up. So in that phase, when you're collecting everything, if you start by asking yourself these questions, you're already kind of ahead and you're doing the right thing. So if you move to the next one, analyzing data and communicating, sharing knowledge, this means that you already have control of that data. So you're again thinking, who truly needs access to this data and these files? Does my whole government need access to this, or is it only a few people that should be seeing these? What tools am I using to analyze this data? Are these custom in-house developed tools? Are internal IT teams in charge of? Or are these vendor systems? Do I know if the vendor can read all of my data, or is it zero knowledge, meaning that even if it's on their servers, that company can still read that data? And if they get hacked, the good thing is that in that case, the hackers can't read their data because they hack their servers and everything is encrypted. So you want to know who you're giving that data to, if it's a vendor solution, and how it's being kept safe. Are we storing and sharing any sensitive data on movable media, USB, external hard drives, and CDs? This is becoming less and less common and less necessary because it is very unsafe and very difficult to track. How many thumb drives are out there, how many CDs are out there? If you can avoid this, that's great. I know it's not possible in every situation, but if you can avoid movable media, that might be best practice, especially now in this new COVID world where everything's being shared digitally. You want to make sure that you do have contracts as well with any of the vendors. So because then you will know exactly what the vendor system is doing. So these are all considerations that you go through as you're going through the life cycle management process. If you go to the next slide. Again, if you really have to use movable media, is it protected by a password? Is it encrypted? Or if I drop it, is somebody going to be able to read it? Then when we are analyzing the data and sharing it, how are we communicating it? Am I just emailing it on any network? Are the networks password protected? Are we using virtual proxy private networks? That means that the data that is being sent is encrypted in transit. Are we only accessing the data from password protected devices that have current antivirus software installed in them? And this is a big pain point for a lot of organizations, companies, and governments, because everybody suddenly had to move and work from home, which meant that people were scrambling and just trying to do their work from any device that they could. But very often our private devices are not taken care of the way they should be, or even if they are given to us by our employer, they're not always taken care of the way they should be. So at this point, you need to think about, well, even if I'm accessing this data from a central server, that's my government server, where am I storing this data? Am I downloading it onto my device that really isn't that safe?
And I think another point here on analyzing data and communicating and sharing knowledge is just around some of that context. So many governments, if you're working in a small community and you're combining two different data sources together and you're analyzing and communicating that data, is it reasonable that in analyzing and developing an indicator in a particular way, you're actually revealing more about individual citizens than you might have originally anticipated? So not only the nuts and bolts of how data is shifting hands or being communicated in that way, but also whatever your final product is. If you start narrowing down to a demographic of 30 to 40-year-olds who are female and employed in a certain way in a small community, combining all those pieces together means you go from a picture where you think you've, reasonably have no privacy concerns to when you start to see, actually, I can figure out who the 3 people are in this data set with relative ease. So having an eye to those, the ways in which data combined can be powerful and can start to have those privacy considerations.
The next piece is going to be communicating, sharing knowledge. And
I stole your thunder, Layla.
Sorry?
I stole your thunder.
You did steal my thunder, but that is more than okay. I think that you do have these questions in here that are helpful, but what you're going to notice is that these questions have a pattern, have a theme, and very often the theme is access. And that is one of the first things that any organization, any government can do to secure themselves, which is access. Knowing how to control it, how to take it away quickly, how to keep track of who has access to what file and who has access to what shared drive or anything else. And you'll see when you go through these questions, when I'm not rushing through them and trying to walk you through them, you'll see that a lot of them, it's access. And that I can guarantee you is the pain point for a lot big companies, not just smaller organizations and smaller governments. So if that helps, access is your kind of first thing on the agenda. Now, the next one, you'll see preserve and archive. So this is once you're already kind of ready to preserve and archive and store everything that you've been doing. What tool are you using to archive and preserve this data? Is it, again, in-house? Is it vendor? Is it safe? Do they have a history of data leaks and data breaches? Do we know how long we need to have this data archived, and what is the data retention period? You know, if you need to have this saved for 7 years, for example, because of legal reasons or regulations. Do you need to preserve the full copy of the data, or can you redact some of it? Or do you need to just kind of dump it and archive it in full readable text, even if it has some sensitive data? Because if you can redact and if you can minimize that data footprint, that can be very useful and can help keep your organization safer. You can go to the next one. Has the archive been, has the archive been tested for disaster recovery? And we've heard in the previous presentation that there's a lot of talk about backups. What you also need to make sure is that those backups are tested, that once a year, every 6 months, depending on what works best for you, is that you try and get that backup back onto your device and see if that actually works. And if you do get actual data that's readable and actual data that's actionable, because what we've seen is that even if it's backed up, and then when something does happen, people try to recover the backup and something goes wrong. The files are corrupted or something fails, and you don't want to be in that situation. Again, there's access again. Who has access to the archive? How do you keep track of who has access to it, and how quickly can you revoke it? Because if there's a set of credentials that ends up being compromised, like my password and my email, and I suddenly get access to your archive, how quickly can you get me out of there, rather than whoever it is that stole my credentials kind of has the ability to download and get to everything? And are the archives encrypted at rest? Meaning not just in transit over VPNs when you're sharing it, meaning also when you store it, wherever that you are storing it, whether it's locally or on a vendor solution, that it is encrypted at rest, and nobody can read it until they actually enter that encryption key. We can go to the next one. Delete, destroy. So this ties into the first phase as well, and it is a cycle for a reason. But do you know exactly where all your data and files are that you've been working on since you collected them? Where has it been copied? And that's why movable media is really dangerous, because it can be copied easily. There's no logs of who copied it, who shared it, and who got access to it. So you don't know where it's kind of been proliferated. And you also need to think about how are you deleting this data from your archives and your devices, because clicking the delete button doesn't always get rid of everything. You're not always kind of done. It's just like, okay, it's gone. It tends to stick around some database, some server, or somewhere where you don't want it. I think that's the end of our questions. Mm-hmm. The next phase is something we're hoping will help you start this cybersecurity and data privacy journey a lot easier, which is the phase 1 of your security maturity, Rebecca's favorite phrase. So the first thing that you need to do, I'm not saying you probably have already done this and you have a good lay of the land and know where everything else, but if you haven't, or if things have been kind of moving through quickly, especially during this past year when everything suddenly became digitized, you want to identify all the platforms you're working with. You want to make sure that you know what you're using to communicate with people, what you're using to collect, handle, or store data. And you want to know the difference between collecting, handling, and storing data. So that all of those phases, that you know exactly what you're using and how the data is traveling between each other. And that is what is meant by data mapping or data flows. So that you're not suddenly surprised and you're like, oh, well, my Slack solution speaks to my Gmail. Oh no, well then what has been shared with Gmail? What do we have in there? Or what the Slack is speaking to another solution? Okay, what has been shared? You want to keep track of all of that. And this is just phase 1, which means sit down and figure out where you are and where all your data is, And that's going to be phase one. So you're not rushing into suddenly implementing a ton of solutions, implementing a ton of cyber security controls or data security controls. That takes time. Your first phase is to calmly sit down and map everything out.
Okay. And just a reminder on our 3 key takeaways here. So again, privacy, security, and are part of every aspect of data management. So we saw all the questions you can be asking yourself, how these different pieces fit together, and really keeping that top of mind is important to build that culture and not just react with a solution or a system, but actually build the culture and have it ingrained in all the work that you're doing. Set those realistic expectations. So if you didn't know the answer to many of the questions that Layla ran through in terms of those data management phases, that's okay. Start by mapping out the systems, assessing the risk, and then figuring out where the attention is most needed and working in that space first. And then lastly, data becomes sensitive when it has context. So what do you need to anonymize? Can you redact components? All of those questions are about understanding what is sensitive, what makes data sensitive, and how you can still actually effectively work with and use data despite the need to have those privacy and security pieces in place.
And if I could just add very, very quickly onto why a system is not a solution right away. That's because one system, everything can get hacked. If somebody tells you that whatever they're giving you is not hackable, that means they're trying to hack you and you need to run. Because absolutely everything can get hacked, and one system is going to have its gaps. So that's why you need to use multiple different systems to kind of close those gaps between them. And you have different data security controls that will help close those gaps in systems. But don't rely on just one, that's for sure. And again, no matter how well everything is put in place, you're never 100% sure, and don't expect to be 100% sure, because as long as you're online, as long as you're using online tools, you're taking on a certain amount of risk, and that is okay as long as you know what risk you are comfortable with.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you so much. Inviting any questions or comments. I also just wanted to flag before that, we did put together some more detailed appendices that talk about the security focus areas, privacy focus areas. So what these mean in more kind of practical terms on the ground, and then some of those governance components, as well as the different phases. And we'll share those with the group after the presentation, so you have access to that material, and it helps kind of pull a few threads from different components of the toolkit together into one place. So thank you very much for having us, and any questions or comments, happy to field them.
Sure.
That was really great, like really clear and well structured. And I think, again, your message is really well taken about take time at the beginning to plan carefully, understand the lay of the land before you jump into doing anything, purchasing anything, working with a vendor on a solution. I've certainly seen many times like, well, we just need a system for this, and then let's customize it 25 times, and then people didn't know what the system was for, and then nobody uses it. So I think that was just very, very helpful. Any questions? Asking folks to throw those in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand. This topic is an area that can feel really scary to people, but I do think that the way both you and Stuart and Bobby described this concept of like, think of the actual people, think of your grandmother, think of others that, how do you want to protect them? And this harkens back actually to Gwen Phillips in webinar 1, who spoke to how data is about, we want to collect data, we want to use data because we care. And that's a grandmother perspective. This isn't a big brother perspective about gathering data in order to surveil people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I just thought that was a really nice thread as someone who's been kind of on all of these webinars, to hear that analogy of grandmother come through and bookend this series.
There's another grandmother analogy which doesn't entirely speak to that, but it says essentially, don't post anything online you wouldn't be comfortable if they printed it out and gave it to your grandma. So that's it's a separate one.
I think too many people break that one too often. Any other closing words, Rebecca, Layla? Doesn't look like we have questions coming in at this point.
None for me. Just thanks for the chance to share some of this with the group. And, if I think people know where to find us if they have follow-up questions once they dig into the material a little bit more and into those different components of the toolkit.